Hello, this is Rudi Kammerer. In the following 20 minutes, I will give you a brief introduction to corporate culture analysis, some of its main exponents, and the relevance of this in the context of intercultural communication training. My guiding questions will be the following. When and why is corporate culture an issue? Who are the most prominent scholars in this field? And how do their findings affect international business communication? You may remember that in the first self-study module on intercultural theory, principally two types of analysis have been identified. Firstly, qualitative research, which adopts methods similar to those applied by anthropologists. Anthropologists, as you probably know, would study alien communities by observing people's ways of coping with life, their social organization, their language or languages, their mythology and other significant stories, and generally speaking, anything that might be interesting in terms of revealing differences to what would seem normal in the anthropologist's home environment. They would then take notes and write reports about what they have experienced. Thus, qualitative research is based on observation and storytelling. From our first module, you may remember one prominent scholar who applied qualitative methods, Edward Hall. Secondly, quantitative research. These methods are often based on self-answer questionnaires handed out to large sample groups. The answers given by the respondents are then processed with the help of statistical evaluation, and the conclusions drawn are based on such statistical analysis. The most prominent scholars in the field of intercultural research are, of course, Hofstede and Trompenaars and Turner, who have been mentioned before. Let us start by looking at quantitative frameworks as suggested by scholars like Hofstede and Trompenaars and Turner. Hofstede, as you probably remember, conducted his research within IBM, where in the 1970s he was working as a management trainer and manager of personnel research. Clearly, IBM is a global enterprise with a strong corporate identity policy and with English as the single corporate language. Against this background of supposed uniformity, it seemed hard to understand why things were dealt with so differently in different IBM subsidiaries. The way superiors treated subordinates and subordinates treated their bosses, the way meetings were run, issues of punctuality or reliability, and many more seemed to differ from subsidiary to subsidiary and to follow anything but the uniform procedures as outlined at IBM's headquarters in Armonk, New York. Observations like these were frequent and were seen to cause a great deal of friction and eventually a considerable loss of money. To identify the hidden reasons for this, Hofstede applied quantitative methods, which had been used within US-American corporations since the 1950s. That is, he and his team developed a questionnaire and had it distributed among a representative sample of IBM staff spread over 64 countries. On the ground of the answers given, he suggested initially 4 cultural dimensions, which later were extended to 6, as shown on the next slide. The main message Hofstede drew from his research is quoted on this slide. If business is to succeed internationally, then organizational structure should follow culture-based dispositions. The diagram on this slide was taken from Hofstede's website and displays the findings concerning 3 arbitrarily chosen countries. Take a moment and look at the chart. Under you would find your own country's position with respect to each of Hofstede's 6 cultural dimensions as compared to those of China and the USA. Thus, your country would rate extremely high under individualism and indulgence, but fairly low on power distance, etc. What type of information do these findings convey? What practical consequences would you draw from them? For Hofstede's own answers, go to the next slide. The overview given in this table indicates the type of approach to cultural analysis as suggested by Hofstede. Again, you may want to take a moment to study this chart. What you will find under power distance, uncertainty avoidance, collectivism versus individualism and short or long-term orientation are indicators of psychological dispositions, such as discipline, precision or commitment. These, Hofstede says, can be expected in companies based in countries rating high or low on his scales of dimensions. In sharp contrast to these, under masculinity, femininity, you will find recommendations concerning types of industry appropriately placed in the respective countries, such as personal services, mass production, heavy industry or biochemistry. Until today, it's not quite clear whether inconsistencies of this type were intentional or simply indicate a lack of coherence in Hofstede's elaborations on his findings. Many critics of Hofstede's approach have pointed out that all his conclusions were based on the statistical evaluations of questionnaires handed out to IBM personnel, and that perhaps conclusions drawn in terms of national cultures lacked validity and credibility. One of Hofstede's critics was his own student von Trompenaars, who felt that having set out with corporate culture analysis, Hofstede had ended up by analyzing what he considered national cultures. Trompenaars' and Turner study was conducted in the context of Shell, another global player. It is true that they too provided lists of nations relating to each of the 6 cultural dimensions suggested by them. Yet much more than Hofstede, Trompenaars and Turner's analysis focused on specifying types of corporate cultures as they saw them. Here is an overview taken from one of their highly influential books. Again, you may want to take a moment to look at the details of this chart. Looking at indicators such as relationships between employees, attitude to authority, ways of changing, or criticism and conflict resolution, Trompenaars and Turner suggests distinguishing between basically 4 types of corporate cultures, which they named family, Eiffel Tower, guided missile, and incubator. You may ask whether typologies of this kind can ever reflect the great diversity of companies really existing worldwide, and also perhaps what practical consequences can be drawn from this. Before answering these questions, however, let's have a look at other influential studies in the field of corporate culture analysis. GLOBE is an acronym and stands for Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness Research. Started in 1991 by Professor Robert House of the University of Pennsylvania, the GLOBE study is an ongoing large-scale project. Most of all, this international study involves over 17,000 middle managers in more than 900 different organizations, rather than one global player like IBM or Shell. To identify leadership competencies to be found in different cultures, the GLOBE researchers use a combination of quantitative instruments supplemented by qualitative methods such as interviews. Among the competence dimensions provided by GLOBE, most have been suggested by others before, such as future orientation, collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, performance orientation, assertiveness orientation, etc. Yet it is the explicit aim of the GLOBE study, as indicated by the quotation given on this slide, to overcome limitations of previous studies, such as those made by Hofstede, Trompenaars and Turner and others. Whether GLOBE is succeeding with this will perhaps remain an open question, because one overriding question, as indicated on the next slide, needs to be discussed before answering this. Whether cultures can be quantified and measured at all, or whether all attempts at quantifying must be seen as misleading, has been a controversial question in the field for a long time. Nevertheless, in the past 20 to 30 years, a great number of professors of organization and management, of organizational behavior, psychology and similar, have provided quantitative research of the kind mentioned above to specify and classify corporate culture types. Here are some prominent examples. On a different note, you may find the next 5 slides a bit confusing, and you may even ask yourself where all of this leads us. But bear with me, I will explain in a minute. Daniel Dennison suggested a two-dimensional model of corporate cultures, which distinguishes corporate cultures along the lines of stability versus flexibility and internal focus versus external focus. Based on his research, he identified 4 types of corporate cultures, which he called mission, adaptability, involvement, and consistency. Charles Handy similarly provided a two-dimensional model, claiming that the degree of centralization, high or low, in relation to the degree of standardization, again high or low, would enable us to classify corporate cultures along the lines of the 4 types he suggested: person, role, task, and power culture. Goffey and Jones' two dimensions referred to the degree of solidarity and socialization to be found in a company. Based on this, they suggested 4 types of corporate culture, which they called network, communal, fragmented, and mercenary culture. Deal and Kennedy again suggested 4 corporate culture types based on feedback and risk dimensions and called them tough guy macho culture, bet your company culture, work hard play hard culture, and process culture. Cameron and Quinn suggested 4 corporate culture types along the lines of control versus decentralization and internal versus external focus. The culture types they identified were called clan, autocracy, hierarchy, and market culture. By now you may feel a bit confused, and perhaps you may have started wondering how many models of corporate culture there are and which, if any, would be helpful in real life. The answer to this question is given by one of the authors himself, Daniel Dennison. Clearly, each of these models is a mental construct, an attempt at establishing order in a largely chaotic world. So all of the authors mentioned above will repeatedly say that in real life you would probably never find a company which fully relates to the types they have identified. Take, for example, an international bank or an insurance company. Would you expect the same type of culture in the IT department as in the accountancy? Would the ways of behavior and dealing with things be the same in public relations as in human resources? Clearly not. So how, when and why can models like the ones presented be helpful at all? For the answer, look at the next slide. Let us assume that Company A is experiencing an existential crisis and must undergo restructuring in order to survive. This could involve things like closing down departments, sections or divisions, or merging them with other departments or even companies. In any case, crisis means people are stressed, nervous, and fear for their jobs. In such situations, organizational development is essential. Facilitated by professional coaches, this often involves processes of self-ascertainment. In other words, finding answers to who are we, what are the strengths and weaknesses of our department, etc. And equally, who are the others, what are their strengths and weaknesses. In processes like this, making the self-perception of a group and the perception of other groups visible, as indicated on this slide, can prove extremely helpful, because this can provide a basis for clarifying identities and mutual aims. There have been many examples where the use of corporate culture models in such contexts have proven very helpful. One thing should be clear, however: none of the models represents reality, but always the perception of reality by the people involved, both in terms of self-perception and of how they see others. This distinction is important to keep in mind. The models do not represent reality, but the perception of it by the people involved. At this point, we should briefly look at the second line of corporate culture analysis, qualitative research. And it's worth remembering in this context that qualitative methods are characterized by observation, communication, storytelling, and history-telling. This is an overview of what to observe, to notice and to ask when trying to get a realistic picture of a specific corporate culture. Take a few moments to go over this list and think about your own experience in the company or companies you have worked for so far. The analytical methods suggested here could briefly be summarized by walk and talk. It is at this point that the mentor of corporate culture analysis, Professor Ed Schein, should be quoted. Ed Schein was probably the first to introduce the term of corporate culture. But quite clearly his confidence in quantitative methods of culture analysis is rather limited. In one of his statements, he explicitly says that in times of crisis it would take him half a day, sitting together with the right people and discussing their company's situation, to obtain reliable information about the specific corporate culture, or rather cultures, he would be faced with. The analytical methods recommended by Ed Schein may be briefly summarized by walk and talk. All of Ed Schein's books on corporate culture have been best-selling books for many years, and his influence on the academic discussion in this area can hardly be overestimated. Interestingly, for one of his most recent books, Schein chose Helping as a title. Remember, Ed Schein is a professor of organizational development and not a social worker. Why do you think he did this? What he means by helping is along the lines of walk and talk. In other words, it is a person's ability to establish mutually acceptable ways of getting on with others through communication and interaction, which must be considered the key to success, both in intracultural and in intercultural encounters. If you want to know more about Professor Schein's approach to corporate culture analysis, we recommend watching this video on YouTube and listening to the speech he gave in Berlin on the 14th of October 2010. You may then be able to answer questions like: how does Professor Schein define culture? What role does communication play, according to him, for corporate effectiveness? And what does he mean by cultural islands? One key recommendation of his relates to international teams and how these can operate successfully. Remember, this was precisely the starting point of quantitative culture analysis as conducted by Hofstede, Trompenaars and Turner and others. Ed Schein's answer, however, is a different one. Rather than saying structure should follow culture, as Hofstede did, he suggests focusing on the communicative competences of all concerned. Building what he calls cultural islands means that international teams, today the rule rather than the exception, need to develop a culture of their own. In other words, it is not the culture of one or even the majority of a team that sets the tone, but it suggests a process of mutually finding ways of dealing with one another respectfully and cooperatively. The metaphor cultural island indicates the key concept to intercultural effectiveness. This becomes particularly important when all persons involved speak English, be it as their native language, be it as their second or third language. When faced with diversity in today's globalized world, complex and confusing as it is, focusing on communicative competencies will prove the key to success or otherwise. Thank you for listening.